Clayton Harkness thought he could take Thomas Reeves's land by force and lock his family away without anyone daring to stop him. A ranch boss with a long reach and a reputation for bending the law to his will, he ruled the valley through fear and intimidation. But John Marshall had old friends, a clear plan, and a reason to ride into the dark that would turn the tables overnight. And just wait until you hear how one night's stand brought the valley a dawn where justice finally took the lead. John Marshall sat on his old wooden porch and watched the sun press molten color across the flats, turning the dust to copper and the clouds to a thin rim of brass. The boards under his boots held the day's heat. A grasshopper ticked somewhere in the steps, and the sign above the stable let out a weary creak each time the wind slid through the yard. He listened the way a rancher listens, counting small sounds, sorting them into harmless and not letting the quiet talk. It had been a still day, the kind that lowers a man's shoulders until the quiet changed. Out past the split-rail fence, a figure came along the wagon track, small and undecided, stopping at every patch of shade as if courage were carried in the shadow of a mesquite. She looked about 17. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained the color of road dust. The laces of her boots were broken and knotted. Her face was streaked, more from a hard ride than from tears, but he could see the shine of recent crying. When she reached the steps, she paused, took in a breath that seemed to scrape, and climbed to the porch. She stood there, thin as a fence plank, trying to hold herself together with both hands. "Papa said you're the only good man left, Mr. Marshall," she said. Her voice shivered the way tin shakes in a gust, each word pulled over stones before it found air. John felt heat rise in his chest, not at her, never that, but at the kind of men who leave a child to plead on a stranger's stoop. He knew before she finished that this was not a courtesy call. In this stretch of country, law bent around money like water around a stone. Bad cattle outfits hired rough hands to do their speaking. Office holders smiled for whoever held the ledger. On such ground, a sentence like the one she had said was not a greeting. It was a flare in a dark field. He set his hat back and told her to sit. She did not. She worked the story out in breaths. Her father was Thomas Reeves, a small farmer who raised alfalfa and a pair of milk cows east of the river. 3 days passed. He had gone to town and never came home. By noon the next day, riders loyal to Clayton Harkness came up their lane and said Reeves owed land to settle a debt that no one had heard of the week before. Harkness had a way of finding debts where fences were straight and titles honest. The riders broke the door and turned out the house. They told the family to sign papers that were not shown long enough to read. When her mother refused, they locked her in the shed and said the key would turn when the papers were signed. The girl, her name was Eliza, had slipped away at dusk and ridden by creek bed to keep her pony's hoofprints quiet. She had heard that John Marshall once stood his ground when standing had cost a man friends. That was why she was here. John let the weight of it settle. He pictured the Reeves place, a low roof under cottonwoods, a narrow well, a broom left leaning in its corner. He could see the door splintered, the latch torn clean. He knew Harkness by reputation, a rancher with a smooth handshake and a long memory for anything that could be turned into leverage. Men like that did not fear courts. They hosted them. John asked Eliza how long her mother had been held. "Since yesterday morning," she said. "Had anyone seen Thomas? Only talk in town that he had signed away what he owned, though Thomas never signed anything he did not read, and he read every line twice." John watched the road beyond the yard out of habit, then looked back to the girl. Wind hushed the porch and set the sign creaking again, like the drawl of a hinge in an empty church. He felt the old anger take its place beside his patience. A rancher minds cattle and weather and fences, but there are days when he must mind people who think fear is a tool. He told Eliza she had done right to come. He poured a glass of water, tipped his hat, and said they would ride at first light because some things a man answers before the sun can. That was so John rode out toward the Reeves place with the late sun stretching his shadow across the baked earth. The trail wound through pastures scoured by heat until even the mesquite looked brittle, their roots clawing for what little moisture was left. Old wells along the way sat with buckets dry, the rope lines slack and frayed. This was Harkness country, its neglect as much a signature as any brand on a calf's hide. Every stretch of land seemed to carry the memory of something taken, A fence cut where the post still leaned outward, gates missing their hinges, and no sound but the shuffle of dust under his horse's hooves. The Reeves farm came into view without the welcome of smoke from a chimney or the bark of a dog. The front gate lay flat on the ground, one hinge twisted like a bent spur. The chicken coop was empty, its wire door swinging idly in the breeze, and across the yard the earth bore the clear prints of horses and boots moving in numbers. It was the kind of mess left by men who didn't care to hide their work. John dismounted and walked the yard with his eyes, letting the stillness tell its story. He found the shed tucked behind the main barn, the door secured with a chain looped twice and locked tight. From inside came no sound at first, only the faint scent of dust and dry hay. When he eased the door open after cutting the lock with the iron tool from his saddlebag, the dim light revealed Mrs. Reeves sitting on a pile of straw. She was pale, her hands folded loosely in her lap as though even that small effort took what strength she had left. Her lips were dry, her eyes lifting slowly to find him. "They took him," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Said if we signed the papers, he'd come back." Each word was deliberate, as if she needed to hold them in place until he understood. John had seen enough dealings under Harkness to know the promise was worth less than the paper it might be written on. In these parts, a man gone 3 days under such hands was a man they did not plan to return alive. But that truth could not be laid at her feet now. Around here, folks weighed their courage against the reach of Clayton Harkness and came up light. Few dared to set themselves in his path. The sheriff worked his post like it was part of Harkness's spread, and the circuit judge was a cousin twice removed, close enough to keep favors close and questions far away. John poured water from his canteen into a tin cup, holding it steady as she drank in small, careful sips. He guided her outside into the evening air, where the light had gone gold along the fence line. She leaned against the porch rail, eyes closing as if drawing strength from the simple act of standing in her own yard again. He looked over the land, rows of withering alfalfa, the barn with one door off its track, and the worn path that led down toward the river. This was a place built by honest work, sunrise to sunset, in weather that tried a person's patience and hands. All they'd earned was the attention of a man who saw every good thing as a chance to claim more for himself. In the fading light, John felt the weight settle in his chest. This wasn't just another neighbor in trouble. It was the same kind of injustice that had once left his own family with an empty chair at the table. The same mark of greed that had taken his brother years ago. That memory never dulled, only shifted in shape, and now it rose sharp again. He rested his hand on the worn wood of the porch post, feeling its rough grain under his fingers, and let the decision take hold. Whatever came, Harkness had chosen his ground, and John would meet him there. The last of the sun slipped behind the ridge, leaving the farm in a long shadow. But in John's mind, the way forward was already lit. The next morning carried a pale light across the rooftops of town, the kind that made the dust along Main Street glow like powdered gold. John walked with purpose, boots striking the boardwalk in an even rhythm, each step taking him closer to men he had not stood beside in years. They were men who, like him, had once known a time when right and wrong were not questions for a court, but answers a man carried in his own hands. He found them where he knew they'd be, leaning against the hitch rail outside the feed store, trading talk low and easy. Hank Boyd was there first, his hat pulled low and the brim worn from years under sun and wind. A marksman with an unshakable eye, Hank carried the quiet of someone who had seen more than most men could bear, yet still kept his hand steady when it counted. Beside him stood Lucas Shepard, tall and watchful, the kind of man who could read the lay of the land as if the soil itself spoke to him. Once a scout for the Union Army, Lucas had the patience of a hunter and the caution of one who had walked alone through country where every shadow might hide trouble. John stopped before them, resting one hand on the rail, and let his words settle heavy. Harkness has taken a decent farmer, and there's no one moving to bring him back. If we leave it, tomorrow it could be our land he rides onto, our gates on the ground. If we don't draw the line here, there'll be nowhere left to draw it. He looked each man in the eye, not for agreement alone, but for the kind of resolve that meant a man would ride through to the end. The street around them stayed quiet, the breeze lifting a corner of the newspaper tacked to the post. Hank's jaw tightened. A small movement, but enough. Lucas gave a single nod. In this stretch of country, the word honor still had weight for a few, and these were two of them. They spoke in short phrases, planning in the way men do who have no need for long explanations. It would be done at night, when the lamps burned low in the bunkhouse at the Harkness spread and the hired guns were dulled by drink. They knew the paths, the timing, and which side of the corral fence to take for cover. There would be no second chances, but there would be no turning back either. John understood the odds, thin as the edge of a spade, and still, the choice was already made. A single true act, he believed, could stir hope in hearts where it had long been buried under fear. As they laid out the few supplies they would carry, coil of rope, extra cartridges, a lantern with the lens blacked on one side, John felt the old current of readiness move through him. It was not bravado. It was the plain knowledge that the ground they stood on was only worth keeping if a man was willing to defend it. By the time the meeting broke and they each went their separate ways to wait for nightfall, the shape of the coming hours was clear. Somewhere beyond the ridge, under the fading light, a prisoner waited in the dark, and before the next sun they would ride for him. The night came down without a moon, leaving the land under a wide sheet of darkness. The wind moved steady out of the west, carrying with it a dry hiss that lifted the dust from the hardpan and laid it across the trail. It was the kind of wind a man could walk in without leaving more than a whisper behind, and John counted on that. He rode with Hank and Lucas until the lights of the Harkness place glimmered faintly through the cottonwoods. Then they dismounted and led their horses into the shadow of a low ridge. From there they went on foot, every step set to the rhythm of the wind, every shift of weight chosen to keep the gravel from telling on them. The yard opened up ahead, the glow of a fire spilling across the ground. At the center of the spread, a tall bonfire crackled, sending sparks high into the black sky. Around it, voices rose in rough laughter, the kind that comes from too much drink, blending with the muffled growl of dogs straining at their chains. Lantern lights spilled from the bunkhouse windows, but no one inside was watching the open ground beyond. John signaled with 2 fingers, and they slid along the shadows toward the nearest post where one of the guards leaned half dozing, his rifle slack in his hands. Hank moved like a shadow through the dust, one quick motion disarming and silencing him before he could raise a shout. On the far side, Lucas took the second sentry just as neatly. The space between the men closed without a sound, the firelight still flickering undisturbed. With the way clear, they made for the main house, a wide 2-story with shuttered windows and a front door set heavy with iron fittings. John eased it open, the hinges giving a slow sigh. Inside, the air was close and smelled of old wood and lamp oil. They moved down the hall until they found the door to the cellar. From behind it came the faint rattle of chain. John went first down the steps, the boards complaining under his boots. The lantern he carried threw its light across the stone walls and settled on a figure hanging by the wrists. Thomas Reeves lifted his head at the sound, his face drawn and pale under the bruises, but his eyes still sharp enough to recognize the man before him. "John," he managed, the words scraping out of him as if it had been waiting all along. They cut him free with quick, careful hands. Lucas steadied him while Hank checked the shadows at the far end of the cellar. Reeves stood on his own after a moment, leaning but unbroken. They were halfway to the stairs when the sound of boots hit the floor above, fast, heavy, and coming toward them. Clayton Harkness burst into view at the top of the steps, revolver drawn, eyes sharp even through the drink. For a breath, the world held still. Then he froze, seeing the barrels pointed back at him from 3 steady hands. John's voice was low, flat, and carried more weight than a shout. "You figured there was no one left in these parts willing to stand for each other. You figured wrong." Harkness's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Hank moved up the steps, took the revolver from his grip, and tossed it aside. They bound his hands and marched him out into the yard where the fire still burned. The dogs barked now, sensing the shift in the air, and a few men in the bunkhouse doorway stepped back when they saw their boss trussed like a calf for branding. John and his men led him to the front gate, tied him to a post where the dawn would find him, and left him under the eyes of his own men, who no longer seemed eager to intervene. They rode from there in a loose line, Reeves between them, the wind at their backs and the horizon starting to pale. When they reached the Reeves place, The first touch of sunlight was painting the roof and the cottonwoods in a soft gold. Word had traveled faster than they had. Neighbors were already gathering in the yard, men and women who had known the fear Harkness traded in. They stood watching, silent at first, as John helped Reeves down and into his own yard again. Something passed between them without the need for words. Proof that a man could still come home if others cared enough to see it done. John didn't wait for praise. He was checking the cinch on his saddle when he heard light steps behind him. Eliza stood there, eyes bright in the morning light. Her hands knotted in front of her as if she wasn't sure what to say. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him. "Papa was right," she said quietly. The words meant for him alone. John gave a single nod, tipping his hat just enough to meet her gaze. In that moment, he knew the ride had been worth every mile. The fight had been more than a rescue. It had been a reminder to the whole valley that justice only lives where people are willing to carry it, even through the dark. And as the sun broke fully over the ridge, the long shadow that had hung over the Reeves farm began to fade.